Hey, welcome back everyone. Today we are going to be making one of my favorite dishes, fried rice. So I worked at a Chinese restaurant for about 7 years and this was one of our regular things. So I usually had to cook this about 5 or 6 times a day. And now I'm just going to share with you the recipe that we ended up using. So if we take a quick look at the recipe, it's a little bit different from what I usually do in class. This is going to be more true to the actual recipe that I cooked in the restaurant, just because you have a lot of time to actually make your rice fresh and possibly use fresh vegetables instead of frozen ones. So the recipe is broken up into two columns. So the one on the left, that's everything that you're going to need to season your pieces of chicken that we're going to use in here. If you don't want to have chicken in your fried rice, that's fine. You can just leave it out and then just use everything on the right column. So that being said, everything in the right column is going to be the rest of the recipe. Okay, so step one is going to be preparing our chicken. So the two things that are going to take the longest in this recipe are going to be the chicken, because we have to marinate it and then let it sit for a bit, and then also cooking the rice. Okay, so I'm going to start off cutting out the chicken. I have my 3 spices here, so I have my teaspoon of salt, my teaspoon of garlic powder, and then my 1/4 teaspoon of white pepper. So what I want to do for this, and I'm actually going to cut it into this container because it has a lid, so then I don't have to worry about covering it with plastic wrap, but I am going to store it in the refrigerator because it's going to take a while before I need it and I don't want it to warm up to room temperature or anything. So I have my 2 chicken breasts right here. And what I want to do is cut this into some bite-sized pieces. So when you think about fried rice, you would have a scoop full of it, and you want to be able to just eat it as is and not have some really big chunks in it. So the best thing here is just to cut these into small strips, like so. And then I'm going to dice those. Okay, so about this size should be good. Okay, they're fairly small, and then as we cook them, they'll get even smaller. Okay, so just cut up your 2 chicken breasts so they're about that size. Okay, so once your chicken is all cut up, you can start seasoning it. So you can throw in your white pepper, garlic powder, and salt. Okay, after that we also need 1 tablespoon of soy sauce. Okay, I like using the Kikkoman. I find it has a much more mild flavor than a lot of the other soy sauces, but you can just use whatever you have. Just put that in there. We need 1/2 teaspoon of sesame oil. Okay, and the last thing that we need is 1 teaspoon of Chinese cooking wine. Okay, and there's a lot of different kinds of Chinese cooking wines that you can get, and most of them are pretty good. Some of them don't have a lot of flavor and are just really salty, but I find that this one actually has a pretty nice flavor to it. So I'll put a teaspoon of that in there. There we go. So give that a quick stir. Just try and coat everything. We're going to leave this for probably about 45 minutes before we end up using it. Okay. So once you have everything nice and coated, if you're using this kind of container, just put the lid back on. If you're using a bowl, just put some plastic wrap on it, and then we'll store it in the fridge until we need it. So now that we're done with the chicken, our next step is to work on the rice. So I have about a medium pot here, it has a pretty good capacity, and then I put my 2 cups of rice in. So you want to make sure that you have a fair amount of space in the pot. Your rice is going to double in size once you're done cooking it. So what we want to do next is take it over to the sink and give it about 3 rinses. Okay, so we're rinsing this because we're trying to get rid of any of the dust or anything that might be on there, because when rice is stored, it goes into like big bins in a facility and then it sits there for a bit. So you could get dust or dirt or anything on there. Like when you look at it, it looks pretty clean, but we're not going to take any chances with that, so we're going to wash that off. Also, rice tends to be very starchy, So we're going to try and get rid of as much starch as possible, because otherwise when you're cooking you get a lot of like starch bubbles that come up and it starts to overflow over the side of your pot, and that sucks. And I mean, it'll still probably do that a little bit if we cook it at a higher temperature, but if we get rid of most of the starch, we should be able to cook this at a bit of a lower temperature and not have to worry too much about that. So whenever you're doing this, make sure you use cold water. Okay. So you just want to cover the rice and get a little bit of extra water in there, and then just move it around with your hands. Okay, so use the circular motion to just kind of swirl it. When you look at the water, it's very cloudy. See, and that's the indication that we're getting a lot of the starch out of there. Okay, so just carefully pour that out. Okay, you don't want to just pour it out real fast, otherwise your rice is going to come with it. Once I get to this point, I try and get as much water out as possible, so I'll just put my hand underneath to try and catch any of the grains that come out. Okay. So that was one. And we're going to do this a couple more times, just to get it a little bit more clean. So I have rinsed it 3 times. I put some water in and switched it around for the 4th time. You can see it's a lot lighter. What I like to do at this point is try and cleanse out as much of the starch as possible. So what I'll do is start pouring, but then I'm going to aim some water at the back to try and get it to run clear. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. So when you look at it now, the water in it is very clear, and I can see the rice on the bottom. Now, when it comes to how much water you want to put in for the rice, you're basically aiming at about 1.5 to 2 cups of water for every cup of rice. And since we have 2 cups of rice here, that means you're going to need about somewhere between 3 and 4 cups of water. So probably about 3.5 will do. I'm not used to actually measuring the amount of water that I put in the rice. Whenever I worked in the restaurant, we basically just got used to eyeballing it so you would know how much rice you actually need. And for me, I've used this pot and this amount of rice so many times, I know exactly how much water I need in it. So for me, it's about, with this pot, it's going to be about, I don't know, I'd say ½ an inch above the line of where the rice is where your water is going to go to. Okay. If you have a rice cooker, this is going to be a lot easier for you to do. You don't have to worry as much about having the exact amount of water. I end up losing a little bit more water because I'm going to be doing this in a pot. So yeah, put in about 3.5 to 4 cups of water. 4 cups would make it a little bit wetter, and 3.5 would make it a little bit drier. Okay, so once you have your water in there, put the lid on and then put it on the burner. You just want to cook it over a like medium to low heat. Okay, you don't want to get too hot, otherwise it starts bubbling over the side. Okay, and we're going to cook the rice until it stops bubbling. And once you lift the lid, you shouldn't really see too much water left in there. But we'll get to that in a little bit. All right, our next step is going to be preparing our veggies. So I don't actually have any frozen vegetables, so I'm going to be using fresh ones instead. So for this, I'm just going to use a little bit of celery and carrots. And I'm going to prepare these similar to what we did with our shepherd's pie or cottage pie. And for that, I'm going to cut this into a couple, well, cut these in half because they're not too thick, and then cut those in half again so I get some little strips. Okay, so they should be pretty similar to what you would get if you went out for chicken wings or something, and they give you some carrots and celery on the side. Okay, so a few carrot sticks here, and what I'm going to do is then dice these. Okay, so remember, I want everything to be small, so if I take a spoonful of fried rice or a forkful of fried rice, then I'll be able to get vegetables and meat and rice and everything with it. Okay, so I'm going to just do a small dice with these. Okay, and just put those in here. And same thing with the celery. I want my celery to be about the same size as my carrots. Okay, so I'll cut those into a few strips and then dice those as well. Okay. So I'm trying to get everything to be about the same size just so that it will cook evenly. Okay, so finish dicing up your carrots and celery. Okay, so I finished dicing up my carrots and celery. There's about a cup, maybe a little more than a cup in there, which is good because I wanted between 1 and 1.5 cups. So the last thing that I have to prep now is going to be my green onions. Okay, so first, whenever you have green onions, make sure you cut off the tips of them. Get any bits that are a little bit dried off on the bottom. Make sure you cut off the ends and then just pull off any of the skin like this that is still on there. Okay, so you want to have a nice clean stalk of green onions, and then we're just going to slice these thinly. Okay, so you don't want it to be too thick because you don't want to have some big chunks of onions inside of your rice. You still want it to give off a good flavor, but you don't want it to be overwhelming. Okay, so there we go. We have these. This is actually going to be the last thing that we're going to add in. We want to make sure that they actually maintain their flavor, because the flavor of a green onion is much more gentle than that of a white onion. So we don't want them to wilt out and lose all of their flavor, which is what will happen if we cook them for too long. So we're going to add these as one of the last ingredients. We'll hopefully mix it for about, I don't know, 30 seconds to a minute and then serve. Okay, so we have these two ready. If you had mushrooms and you're interested in a mushroom fried rice, that is actually a really good choice as well. You would just try and slice your mushrooms very thin and then cook them first. Okay, but this recipe doesn't use that. This is just a very simple chicken fried rice. So all we have to do now is wait for our rice to be done, then we can start cooking the chicken. And while we're here, while you're waiting for your rice to be done, do not open the lid. Okay, long grain rice is one of those ones that does not need to be stirred. You just want to leave it alone. So if you open the lid, it's going to make it take longer to cook because you're going to be removing all of the steam. Okay, so while you have the lid on, it creates this little pocket of hot air, and that's going to make it cook faster. If you keep opening the lid and checking on it, you lose all of that heat and it takes a lot longer to cook. Okay, so wait a while. You'll know that it's cooking because there'll be a bunch of steam coming out. Just let it steam. Once that starts to slow down and you notice that there's not a lot of steam coming out anymore, just quickly open the lid to check to see if there's any liquid left. And if there isn't, then just put the lid on, take it off the heat, and just let it rest. So my pot was steaming quite a bit before, but it's starting to slow down. So this is the point where I would want to check it. So when you open up the lid, so there's still quite a bit of steam and some bubbling. So I'm just going to close that off. At this point, it probably only needs another 1 to 2 minutes, and then I will turn off the heat and then set it at one of the back burners that isn't hot. My rice is all done, so now I can get on the actual cooking part. So if you have a wok, that works out really well. I have one, but I find that with rice it tends to stick because mine is completely stainless. So if you have a non-stick wok, that would be perfect. This is the biggest thing that I have that's non-stick, so this is what I'm going to end up using. So barring having a wok, you want to have something with high sides on it so that as you're mixing you don't get a lot of rice falling out. So I'm heating this over medium. I have 2 tablespoons of oil in here. So I just want to move that around so I can coat the bottom. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is cook my eggs. Okay, so I have my 2 eggs. I put in a little bit of salt and pepper, maybe about a 1/4 teaspoon of each, just to season it up a little bit. So I'll mix those up. and then give them a light fry. Okay, so we're going to fry these a little bit so that they're like scrambled eggs, and then we're just going to take them out and save them for later. Okay. So I don't want my pan to be too hot, just because I don't want these to color or anything. I just want them to cook up. So for this, I like using the spatula just because it's easy to get all the egg together and move it around. Especially when you're working with something that's non-stick, you don't want to use metal tools because then you scrape the bottom. So a non-stick pan has, I think it's carbon tetrafluoride. So it is a very stable compound, and that's what makes it non-stick, but at the same time it's toxic for you, so you don't want to eat it. Okay, so for this I want to use plastic or rubber tools just so I don't get that in my food. That should be good. I basically just want to cook them until they're not really wet anymore. Okay, so I'm just going to scoop these out, and we're going to put them back into the rice pot at a later point. I try and take them out now just because I don't want my egg to get too broken up. Otherwise, if I mix it through, I'm going to end up with like tiny little pieces like this through the whole thing. I like having some larger chunks in there just so that you can actually taste the egg. So now I'm going to add another couple tablespoons of oil. Just heat up a little bit more, and then we're going to start frying our chicken. Alright, so I'm going to start using this spoon. I have a spoon and a flipper, and I find that these are good to use because I can use this to move a lot by scooping. This is good to get underneath and be able to turn it. Okay, there's going to be a lot of heat on the bottom, and I don't want the rice or anything else to burn when I finally add it. So I'll give this one last stir, and then put that in. Okay, so I'm just going to cook this until the pieces are going to be this color, so it should be like a light brown on the other side, and the juices should be clean. And I'll know that these are well cooked because once they are, I can push on them and break them apart pretty easily. Okay, and it should be the same color all the way through, no more pink anywhere. Here we are. So the chicken is pretty much cooked at this point. It's not pink anymore. One of the things that is nice about cutting your chicken up beforehand is the fact that since the pieces are small, it tends to cook very quickly. So if you have a thermometer, you can always check the internal temperature, and it should be about 165 degrees or more. And if not, the juices are running clear out of here, and if I take a piece, I can cut that in half pretty easily. Okay, so that's a good sign that it's cooked. We're still going to keep cooking it anyway, so this is a good point that I can move on to the next step. So the next step here is to put my rice in. Okay. So just get your whole thing of cooked rice. Okay. And after this, I'm going to turn down the heat to medium. Okay, so I don't want the heat to be too high. Otherwise, the rice is going to possibly burn. Okay, so remember, I got my two things, so I can use this to get underneath, and use the other one just kind of support so that I don't turn it and flip it outside of the pan. Okay, so mixing those up. I also want to add in my vegetables. So for me, I have uncooked vegetables. The chicken is hot, the rice is hot. This will help it to cook a little bit faster. If you have frozen vegetables, you basically just want to cook it until they're hot. Okay, so The best way to check that is if you're using peas and carrots, you would just grab a pea, give it a little squeeze, and see if the inside of it is hot or if it's still cool or frozen. Yeah, so just carefully mix that. You don't want any rice to just sit on the bottom for too long, otherwise it will burn. Oops, yeah, be careful. The pan is pretty full, so it's pretty easy to get some of it over the side. Okay. I might try this with my spatula as well, just to see. Okay, and really we just want to mix this for about 4 or 5 minutes so that we can soften up these vegetables a little bit. Alright, it has been 2 to 3 minutes. What I'm going to do now is just add in my soy sauce. Okay, so I have 1/2 cup. I feel like this is always a good starting point. I usually add a little bit more, but I can do this on an individualized basis. So once I get a bowl of fried rice, I can see if it needs a little bit more soy sauce, and then I can just add it to my own. Okay, some people like their food a little bit saltier than others, so you don't want to go too much more than 1/2 cup to start, just so that it doesn't get too salty. Okay, and then just keep mixing it through. You want to get a very even color on the rice. Okay, that will indicate that you've been able to mix your soy sauce in thoroughly. You shouldn't have any big chunks of white rice anymore. Alright, so we're almost done here. The last things that we have to add are the sesame oil, the eggs, and the green onions. Okay, so at this point, there we go. I'm going to add my eggs back in. Right there. I'm just going to chop them up a little bit. Okay. And then I'm going to mix those through. Okay, so I started using my spatula just because I found that it was a little bit easier to get underneath of everything. Okay, and that is really the key here. You want to get underneath and turn, okay, so that you're cooking the rice evenly and you're not allowing any of it to just sit on the bottom for a long time. Okay, we got that in there. I'm going to add about 1 to 2 teaspoons of sesame oil. Okay, so it depends on how much you want in there. I'm just going to give it a light drizzle. Okay. So between 1 and 2 teaspoons, and I'll just mix that in. Okay, you can also make fried rice out of old cold rice. So if you had leftover rice from the night before and you want to just make some fried rice out of it, that works out really well. The only thing you have to keep in mind, it will take a lot longer to heat it up, especially if you do it on a lower heat, but you also have to add more liquid to it. Okay, the rice is going to lose a lot of moisture as it sits in the refrigerator overnight, and you're going to have to add some extra water to it as you're cooking just to try and get the moisture levels back up. Okay. The last thing I'm going to do, I have my green onions. I'm going to add about half of them in now, and I'm going to save the rest as a garnish for the top. Okay, so mix some of that in. Okay, as I was saying before, I don't want to mix this in too long, just because I'm trying to preserve some of the onion flavor. Okay, so probably about 30 seconds or so should do. And we're done. Okay, so that's all there is to it. You want to take it off of the heat because you don't want it to sit there because that could burn. But basically, at this point, just grab yourself a bowl or bowls for everyone. Yeah, scoop some out. And then give yourself a little garnish of green onions on the top. Okay. And there is your bowl of chicken fried rice.